I grew up in a small mountain town, the kind of place where the streets were narrow, winding, and mostly unpaved, and where everyone knew each other's business, or at least thought they did. Our house sat at the base of a ridge, and beyond the backyard, the slope rose sharply into dense forest. The trees were mostly fir and spruce, tall and straight, so that the canopy blocked most of the evening light by the time it reached our property. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you could hear your own breathing in the dark, and the mountains pressed in on every side, so that the horizon felt like it belonged to something larger than us. Our nearest neighbor lived uphill, set back in a small clearing where he kept goats. Everyone in town said he was eccentric. I didn't know anyone personally who had spent much time with him. He didn't talk to strangers, didn't seem to visit the town often, and his house was the sort that looked like it had grown out of the ground rather than been built by hand. From what I could tell, it was simple wood, rough and weathered, with a tin roof that gleamed in the sun. I first noticed him when I was about 12. I was lying on the living room floor, staring through the window at the ridge, when I saw a figure standing at the crest. He didn't move. He just stood there, his silhouette clear against the darkening sky. There was something about the way he held himself, rigid but calm, that made the hair on my neck rise. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. He didn't wave or turn, didn't shift his weight or look around. He simply remained there, immovable, long after the sun had gone down and the first stars appeared. I told my parents, and they shrugged it off. My father said the man liked to watch the mountains. That made sense at first. He had goats to tend, trails to check. But over the years, I noticed the same figure on countless nights, standing at the ridge, often for hours. Sometimes the silhouette appeared in the middle of the night, when the only light came from the moon. It never moved. The goats were the first sign that something was off. We started to notice them disappearing one by one. At first, we thought it was wild predators. The bears in the area were active, and mountain lions weren't uncommon. But there was no evidence left behind. No tracks, no blood, no fur dragged away. Just goats gone. My father went up to the man's house once, hoping to talk to him about it. He came back later, pale and silent for a few minutes, then said the man claimed predators. That was the explanation he offered, and my father, stubborn and polite, left it at that. I never understood why my father never pressed further. Maybe he trusted the man's word, or maybe he didn't want to provoke a confrontation in the mountains. I began to notice patterns. The silhouette on the ridge would appear more often when something had vanished. It was subtle at first. A goat missing, a chair moved, a fence gate open. I started keeping a mental log of the nights when the figure appeared. I realized that if I stayed quiet and watched from my window, I could sometimes see the man move slightly, but only in the smallest increments, shifting his weight on one leg or tilting his head. Those moments were fleeting, and he would remain motionless for the rest of the night. He never came closer. He never entered our property, but I felt the weight of his presence, heavy and cold, as if the mountains themselves had a watcher embedded in their ridge. The ridge was steep. The forest around it was thick. Most people didn't climb it except for hiking in summer. In winter, the snow was deep and treacherous. I tried to imagine how the man could maintain that figure for hours at night without fatigue, without moving. I thought about it endlessly. At first, I assumed he had some makeshift perch or platform at the crest of the ridge, something hidden in the trees. But no structure ever appeared. I watched him in every season. Snow, rain, dry heat. The silhouette persisted. Even when a heavy snowfall blanketed the ridge, I could make out the faint outline of his body against the pale white of the mountain. When I was 16, I tried following the ridge from a distant trail. I stayed low in the trees, careful to avoid leaving a path of my own. It was a warm spring evening, and the air smelled of pine and wet soil. I approached the clearing from below, expecting to find a house, a porch, some indication of human life. Instead, I found only the trees, the slope, and faint tracks that led into the dense forest. I followed them cautiously. They were too human to be animal, but they didn't make sense. They twisted around in ways that no one would walk, and they disappeared abruptly on the ridge without leading to the house. I crouched behind a tree, peering through the branches. The man never appeared. I don't know why I expected him to, but I did. It was the first time I felt real fear. By the time I was 18, I had become accustomed to noticing the silhouette. Nights where he appeared were colder, darker somehow, and the air carried a subtle tension. The goats were mostly gone. People in town stopped talking about the man entirely, as if erasing him from conversation would make him disappear. But I still saw him on the ridge. I saw him standing for hours, staring down at the town, at our house, at the valley, and I realized he had no reason to be there except for himself. He wasn't watching the goats. He wasn't watching the mountains. He was watching us. After he died, I went past his property once while hiking. The forest had grown around the clearing, swallowing the path he used to walk. His house was gone. The roof had collapsed. The tin sheets had rusted and curled inwards. Trees had grown through the floorboards. I expected relief to come with his absence, but it didn't. The ridge still seemed heavy, as if it remembered him. Years later, hikers reported seeing a tall figure moving on all fours near the property. They described it as human-shaped but unnaturally long-limbed, and they were terrified. I didn't believe them at first, thinking it was the play of light and shadows, or deer bending in strange ways under the trees. But I knew what they had really seen. It was the ridge remembering him. It was the forest preserving the weight of someone who had watched, waited, and never left. I still dream about that silhouette. I see it every time I close my eyes, standing at the crest of the ridge behind our old house. I dream about the hours it spent watching, the way it never moved, never blinked, never breathed in a way I could measure. I dream about the goats, disappearing one by one, and the empty clearing where the man's house once stood. And I wake up in the morning with a lingering sense that someone, or something, is still observing from the ridge. The ridge itself has become part of my memory, inseparable from the shape of that man, and the weight of it presses on me as tangibly as the mountains themselves. Even now, driving past that town, I find myself glancing at the slopes, scanning the ridges where the trees bend against the sky. I know I will never see him again, but I cannot shake the sense that he left a part of himself embedded in the land, something unmovable, quiet, and patient. It is not supernatural. It is not imagined. It is simply the way a human can leave a permanent mark on the world, simply by being there and waiting, watching, and letting the silence stretch across decades. I have accepted that. I have accepted the weight of someone who was always there, even when he was gone, and the knowledge that some presences, no matter how human, can feel as immense and unshakable as the mountains themselves. The ridge behind our house, the steep slope, the trees, the clearing where the goats once grazed, the spot where his house used to stand, it all remains a map of his presence. I can trace it in my mind, step by step, memory by memory, and it is impossible to forget. The man is gone. The goats are gone. The house has crumbled. And yet the ridge continues to hold him in the way that mountains hold rock, and I realize that some lives leave their mark not in what they built, but in the quiet and patient ways they existed. That silhouette will stay with me, always, a testament to observation, to stillness, and to a human presence so persistent it became part of the land itself. I do not see him anymore, but the ridge, the trees, the clearing, the slope, all carry him. And I know that when the sun sets, when the shadows stretch across the valley, and the wind shifts through the firs, someone somewhere will glance at that ridge and feel that same weight, the imprint of a life lived on the edge of the mountains, quietly, entirely, and indelibly. It is real. It happened. And it is unforgettable. The ridge is still there, and I still watch it. The silhouette is gone, but the presence remains. I have learned to live with it. I moved into the basement apartment because it was cheap and close to the warehouse where I had just been hired. I needed distance from the last place I lived and from the person I lived with there. I needed quiet. The town sat in a low stretch of rural Pennsylvania where the roads bent around fields and the trees leaned in close. The house itself was older and heavy. It pressed into the ground like it had settled there and decided not to move again. My apartment was reached by a side door that opened straight into the basement. The steps were narrow and smelled like damp wood and dust. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck near the furnace. I told myself that the price made it fine. The landlord lived upstairs with his brother. I did not see the brother much. Sometimes I heard his boots on the floor above me late at night. Sometimes I smelled cigarette smoke through the vents, even though the landlord said no one smoked inside. The landlord was friendly in a careful way. He did not linger. He gave me the keys and pointed out where the trash went and where to park. He told me the house behind the property was empty and had been for a while. It sat past the tree line with a sagging fence between us. He said not to worry about it. The first week passed quietly. I worked nights at the warehouse and slept during the day. The basement stayed cool even in the afternoon. The window by my bed looked out at the backyard and the trees beyond. I noticed the house back there on my first day because it stood taller than I expected. It was set farther back than it looked, a pale shape through the branches. At night it disappeared into the dark. Then I saw the lights. It was after midnight when I noticed the first one. I was lying in bed with the room dark and the fan on low. A square of yellow light appeared through the trees where the house should have been empty. It stayed on for maybe 10 minutes, and then went dark. The next night there was nothing. The night after that a different light came on in a different place. Sometimes only one room lit up. Sometimes the entire house glowed like it was occupied again. There was no pattern that I could tell. The hours changed. The rooms changed. Some nights there was nothing at all. I mentioned it once to the landlord when I passed him on the stairs. He shrugged and said it was probably kids messing around. He said it happened sometimes in places like this. I wanted to believe him because the explanation was easy. Kids were a simple answer. The coughing started the same week. It woke me up the first time. I had been asleep for maybe an hour when I heard it right under the window. It was low and wet and controlled like someone trying not to be loud. It happened 3 times. There was a pause between each one. Then nothing. I lay there waiting for it to come back. It did not. The next night it happened again. 3 times. Always under the window. Always at night. I started sleeping with the fan off, so I could hear better. That made the room feel too quiet. Every sound felt close. I began to notice other things. Footprints in the wet dirt by the fence. The gate in the fence hanging open when I was sure it had been closed. The smell outside changing. There was a sour smell some mornings that clung to the air near the trees. It reminded me of old basements and rot. I told myself it was just the season changing. One night I saw the figure. I was awake and watching the yard because sleep had stopped coming easily. The road beyond the trees cast a thin wash of light through the branches. A shape moved between the trunks and blocked that light. It was tall enough to do that, but not tall enough to stand straight. It did not walk forward. It shifted sideways like it was testing the ground. It stayed there for a long time. I counted my breaths until I lost count. Then it slid back into the trees and the light returned. I stopped opening the window after that. I learned about the house behind us later from someone at work. It came up in a slow conversation about the town and its empty places. He said the man who lived back there had died alone and was not found for months. He said the smell had reached the road before anyone went inside. He said the house had been cleared out recently. That detail stuck with me because the coughing had started the same week I noticed a truck back there and men carrying boxes out. I had assumed it was the kids again. I had assumed a lot. The lights kept coming on. The coughing kept happening, always 3 times. I started marking the nights in my head. I noticed that the coughing never happened on nights when the lights stayed off. I noticed that the lights often came on just after I got home from work. I noticed that the smell was strongest after rain. I checked the locks twice before bed. I stacked boxes in front of the door once. I did not sleep well. I started to feel watched even during the day. The basement felt smaller. The ceiling pressed down harder. I heard the brother upstairs moving at odd hours. I heard the back door open and close late at night. The answer came in pieces, and it came from the ground. I found a shallow pit near the fence one afternoon when I took the trash out. The dirt was darker there. It had been disturbed recently. There were scraps of fabric and paper half buried. The smell was strongest there. I realized then that the belongings from the empty house had not all gone with the truck. Some had ended up behind our place. I watched more carefully after that. I noticed a pattern in the lights. They came on when someone was inside and moved room to room. They went off when that person left. I noticed the coughing always happened near my window because it was closest to the fence and the pit. Someone was spending time there. Someone who coughed in a way that sounded deep and damaged. Someone who shifted sideways because standing straight hurt. I did not confront anyone. I did not need to. I saw the brother one morning through the back window when I was getting ready for work. He stood near the fence with a shovel. His shoulders were hunched. His head hung low. He coughed 3 times and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. He looked toward the trees and then back at the house. He moved like he was trying not to be seen. The rest made sense after that. The brother had been going into the empty house at night and sorting through what had been left. He took what he wanted and brought what he could not use back to our yard to hide it. He turned on lights to see. He avoided patterns to avoid attention. He coughed because his lungs were ruined from years of smoking and whatever else he had done to them. He stood under my window because the fence hid him there and the ground was soft. The smell came from what he buried and from the things he carried close to his body. I moved out the next week. I did not tell the landlord why. I did not need to. I left quietly and cleaned the apartment the way I was supposed to. On my last night there, the lights in the empty house stayed off. The yard was still. There was no coughing. I slept for a few hours and woke up without fear for the first time since I had moved in. The explanation did not make the nights feel less real. It did not erase the sound of those coughs under my window or the way the figure had blocked the road light. It only gave them a shape that fit inside the world I knew. That was enough. We rented the duplex because it was cheap and close enough to campus that we could walk when the buses stopped running. It sat near the edge of the city where the streets widened and the houses thinned out. Cornfields started a few blocks away. The building was old and divided straight down the middle, mirror layouts with separate front doors and small back porches. The siding peeled. The steps leaned. The landlord took weeks to answer messages and never fixed anything fully. My roommate and I were broke and tired most of the time. We both worked late shifts and took early classes. Quiet mattered more than comfort. The neighborhood looked dead in the evenings. Most houses had lights on but no movement. No kids. No dogs. No one sat outside. The only people we ever noticed were the neighbors in the other half of the duplex. They were an older couple. We never learned their names. They never waved. Never brought in groceries when we were outside. Their curtains stayed closed at all hours. The garage door never opened. Snow piled in front of it all winter, without a tire mark. Their porch light stayed off even at night. Their mailbox filled up until someone removed the mail in a single thick bundle once a week. It was always gone by morning. I tried not to think about them. I assumed they were private or sick or both. People at the edge of town tended to be like that. They lived near others but not with them. The night of the snowstorm was quiet even for that place. The forecast warned of heavy accumulation and wind. By evening the roads were empty. The snow fell thick and straight, not drifting yet, just stacking. I stayed up late working at the kitchen table while my roommate slept. The heater clicked and failed to keep up. The windows frosted at the corners. Around midnight I stood up to stretch and looked out the back window toward the porch. That was when I saw the footprints. They were clear and deep. Each step pressed down to the concrete beneath the snow. They came from the neighbor's back door, crossed the narrow strip of yard, and stopped at our porch steps. There were no prints leading away, none circling back, just a single path ending at the bottom step. I opened the back door and cold rushed in. Snow blew sideways. The prints were fresh, edges sharp. No snow had filled them yet. I scanned the yard and the alley beyond. Nothing moved. No sound except wind and the faint hum of power lines. I shut the door and woke my roommate. He shrugged it off in the morning light. He said someone probably walked up, knocked, and left before the snow deepened. He said I was tired. I wanted to believe that. It was easier than standing in the kitchen again and counting the steps, noticing how even they were, how careful. The snow kept falling for 2 more days. We did not see anyone outside. The prints filled in and disappeared. Classes resumed. Life returned to its narrow routine. Then things on our porch started changing. It began small. Shoes that we left outside were turned to face the door. Not moved far. Just rotated. A plastic chair shifted a few inches. A bag of salt leaned against the wall instead of sitting flat. I noticed these changes without thinking much about them. I assumed my roommate had done it while half asleep or in a rush. He assumed I did. One morning I found the chair pulled directly in front of the door. It blocked the handle enough that I had to push it aside to leave. The snow around it was smooth. No prints. The chair legs had not left clear marks. It looked like it had been placed before the last snowfall and lightly dusted since. I felt watched then. Not in a dramatic way. Just a sense of being observed by someone patient. A few days later the note appeared. It sat on the porch railing, weighed down by a pebble. Plain paper torn from a notebook. One word written in careful block letters. Listening. I stood there for a long time holding it. The paper was dry. The pebble was warm from the sun. I threw both away and scrubbed my hands at the sink. My roommate laughed when I told him. He said it was a prank. He said college kids nearby probably wandered over during the storm. He said I was reading too much into nothing. He had always been better at dismissing things. The night started to stretch. Every sound felt closer. The walls between the duplex halves were thin. I heard faint thumps sometimes. Not footsteps. More like something being shifted slowly. The neighbors' windows stayed dark. No light leaked from behind the curtains. Their porch remained untouched by snow except for a narrow cleared path that appeared one morning and vanished by evening. Weeks passed. The note stayed in my thoughts. I started checking the locks twice. I left lights on. I watched the back window when I worked late. The police came on a gray afternoon after someone reported not seeing the neighbors for a long time. I watched from our front window as an officer knocked. No answer. He walked around the back. Another car arrived. They forced the door. The house was empty. I did not mean empty, as in abandoned with furniture covered in sheets. It was empty in a way that felt wrong. Bare floors. No pictures. No clothing. No marks where couches or tables had been. The walls looked scrubbed. The closets held nothing but dust. The fridge was clean and unplugged. It looked like no one had lived there for months. The officer asked if we had noticed anything strange. I told him about the footprints and the porch. He wrote it down and nodded without expression. He said someone would keep an eye on the place. After that, the activity did not stop. Fresh footprints appeared again after a light snowfall. Same path, same careful spacing. They ended at our steps. I checked the neighbor's door. It was locked and snow-covered. No prints there. The path started from the center of their yard this time. Items moved more often. Shoes inside the porch closet were shifted. The chair faced the door again. The salt bag was stacked neatly against the wall. I set up a small camera inside the kitchen, pointing at the back door. It recorded nothing but static shadows and blowing snow. The porch itself remained out of view. The landlord refused to install lighting. One night I stayed awake until dawn. I sat in the dark and listened. Around 4 a.m, I heard movement outside. Slow pressure against wood. Not a knock. More like someone leaning close. Breathing did not carry through the door, but I felt it anyway. By morning the porch was rearranged again. The police returned after I called. They walked the yard. They followed the prints. They ended where they always did. The officer said someone might be approaching from the alley and stepping carefully to avoid leaving a return trail. He said kids did things like that. He suggested motion lights. The footprints continued even after the neighbor's house was boarded up. They came from nowhere. Always fresh. Always ending at us. The explanation came when I stopped assuming the neighbors mattered. I noticed a narrow path worn through the snow along the fence line behind the duplex. It led toward the fields. I followed it during the day. It curved away from the road and disappeared into a stand of trees. There I found a small camp hidden under brush. Tarps. Blankets. Food wrappers. A notebook with empty pages torn out. Someone had been living there quietly for a long time. Close enough to watch. Close enough to listen through the thin walls at night. Close enough to learn our routines. The neighbor's house had been empty long before we arrived. The curtains were closed to hide that fact. The garage stayed shut because there was nothing inside. Someone had used the house as cover. A place to stage movement. A place to make prints that led somewhere harmless. The person never entered our home. They did not need to. They only wanted proximity. Control of space. The porch was their boundary. The note was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. I moved out within the week. My roommate stayed longer. The footprints stopped after spring came and the snow melted. Without snow there was no record. No proof. Just the memory of careful steps ending at a door. I moved into a shared house not far from the city hospital where I worked nights. The rent was cheap, and I was trying to save money after a rough year, so it made sense. My room was small, just enough for a bed and a dresser. A thin carpet covered the floor, stained in places where the previous tenants had spilled things, but it was clean enough. The house itself was old, the kind of building where the floorboards creaked under your weight, and the plaster walls carried the faint smell of damp and old paint. I never minded. It was quiet during the day, and that was what mattered. My room faced the alley, and across it, maybe 20 feet away, lived an older woman. The house she occupied was a narrow, squat building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Curtains were always closed, and I never saw her leave. She was just there, a constant presence across the alley, separate from everything else. The first time I noticed her, it was winter. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, leaving a thin layer on the ground. I was leaving for a shift at the hospital and saw her through the small gap in the curtains, standing on her porch. She held something in her hands, a small bowl, and placed it carefully on the step outside her door. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone performing a ritual. I assumed it was for a stray cat or dog. There weren't many animals around, but it made sense. I went about my shift, thinking little of it. The next morning I noticed another bowl, this one slightly larger, sitting in the same spot. The contents were raw meat. The smell hit me faintly as I walked past, coppery and sharp, carried on the cold air. I looked around but saw no animals. No cats crouched nearby, no dogs wandering in the alley. Only the woman watching, silent and still. Over the next few days, this became routine. Each morning I'd pass the alley and find 1 or 2 bowls. Sometimes beef, sometimes chicken, occasionally fish. The meat never appeared spoiled, always fresh in some way, and she never seemed to remove it after placing it. Still, no cats ever came. No birds, no rats. Nothing. Just the bowls, heavy with raw meat, lined along the cracked concrete steps. I started noticing her behavior in small ways. She never came out during the day, never walked to the store or visited anyone. The only time I ever saw her was in the early morning, always standing at the edge of her porch, staring toward my window. At first, it was vague. A figure moving behind the curtain, a shadow in the doorway. But then I installed a security camera outside my room. It was an inexpensive one, mostly for peace of mind during night shifts. That's when the pattern became clear. Every night, between 3:08 and 3:15, she would appear in the alley. Motion alerts on my phone would wake me. The image was grainy, but enough to make out the woman standing perfectly still, facing my window, staring. Not blinking, not moving her head, not adjusting her clothes. Just standing. Always the same time, every night. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe she had habits I didn't understand. I told myself that it didn't matter, that as long as she didn't try to come into the house, there was nothing I could do. But it gnawed at me. The exact timing, the stillness, the way she never acknowledged anyone else in the alley. The bowls of meat, always fresh, never consumed. The alley itself was narrow, bordered by my house on one side and hers on the other. Trash bins leaned against walls, the occasional broken chair or abandoned bike scattered along the edge. The ground was cracked asphalt with weeds growing through the gaps. It smelled faintly of mildew and wet earth, a damp smell that lingered after rain. At night, the alley was silent except for the occasional car passing on the street behind our houses. But in those quiet hours, her presence felt heavy, oppressive. Standing at the edge of her porch, she seemed almost impossibly still, like a figure carved from stone. One morning, after a night shift, I stepped outside to take out the trash and found 3 bowls on her porch. The meat inside was perfectly cut, arranged in neat portions. I checked the alley and found no footprints, no indication anyone had taken it. I went back inside, shaking slightly, trying to tell myself I was imagining patterns. I wasn't. The camera didn't lie. The woman appeared every night, always the same time, always staring at my window. It escalated slowly. One night, I woke to the motion alert and peered out the window. Her figure was there, closer than usual, the shadow stretching long across the alley. I could see her face now, pale, lined, expressionless, almost unnaturally still. Her eyes were fixed on my window, unblinking. I backed away, heart racing, my hands trembling. I told myself again to ignore it, to stay calm, to leave her be. But something in the way she stood, completely unresponsive to anything around her, made me feel unsafe in a way I couldn't explain. A week later, I woke to a different kind of noise. It wasn't the motion alert, but a faint scraping sound from the alley. I pressed my ear to the window, straining to hear. The sound was intermittent, like metal dragging across concrete. I watched as she moved slowly along the alley, dragging a small cart behind her. On it were more bowls of meat. She placed them on the ground, perfectly aligned, then stepped back to the edge of her porch and resumed staring at my window. No cats came, no animals disturbed the bowls, nothing touched them. I went back to bed, unable to sleep, feeling exposed and trapped in my own room. It went on like that for weeks. I began timing my own routines around her appearances. I kept the blinds closed at night, turned the camera toward the alley, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. But it was impossible to forget. Every shift at the hospital, I carried a low, constant tension, aware that across the alley someone was performing a ritual I could not understand. Then came the day paramedics arrived. I had just returned from work, exhausted, and noticed the ambulance parked in front of her house. They moved quickly, carrying equipment and speaking in low tones I couldn't make out. I watched from my window as they entered her home and came back out with a stretcher. The woman was pale, unresponsive, her body wrapped in a blanket. They loaded her into the ambulance, and it left with sirens off, lights flashing quietly in the winter morning. The alley was empty, silent. I expected some change afterward. I thought the bowls would disappear, the meat removed, the house abandoned. But that wasn't the case. The bowls remained on her porch, exactly where she had left them. I watched, waiting for signs of someone taking them, for the animals she had supposedly been feeding to appear. Days passed, then weeks. The meat vanished. Not spoiled, not thrown away, just gone. No trash collection had come, no one entered the house, no cats or dogs. It disappeared silently, as if absorbed by the alley itself. I never discovered who took it or how. The house stayed empty for months. Sometimes I peeked into the windows, the curtains still drawn, the interior dark and undisturbed. The bowls continued to vanish, always gone by the next morning. I eventually stopped noticing the time she would have appeared. The motion alerts no longer woke me. I didn't sleep better, but the oppressive feeling lessened. I assumed the routine had ended with her absence, yet the mystery of the meat lingered. I moved out of that house a year later. The new tenants never mentioned her or the meat. I never learned her story, her habits, or the reason behind the bowls. I never understood the precision of her actions, or the way she had watched me so consistently. But the image of her, standing in the alley at exactly 3:08 in the morning, silent and unwavering, stayed with me for years. It was a quiet kind of horror, a presence that made me question normality and the limits of human behavior. The empty house and the disappearing meat became a mark in my memory, a reminder that sometimes what's frightening isn't violent or loud, but simply unexplainable, deliberate, and entirely real. Even now, whenever I pass an alley with old buildings and peeling paint, I feel a shiver. I don't think of ghosts or monsters. I think of her, the woman who left bowls of meat for no one, who stared at my window with an unblinking gaze, who vanished from the world without explanation, leaving her strange, silent routine behind. And I remember the meat disappearing. Not eaten, not spoiled, just gone, always gone. I moved into the house in late summer because the rent was low and my job let me work from anywhere. The town sat off a 2-lane highway in the south, far enough from anything busy that nights stayed quiet. The house was small and old, with soft floors and a porch that leaned a little toward the yard. Trees ringed the property on 3 sides. The 4th side faced the road. Across the road, past a shallow ditch and a broken fence, the woods started again. Somewhere back there sat my nearest neighbor's trailer. I did not know his name. No one mentioned it when I signed the lease. The landlord said only that the trailer had been there longer than the road. He said the man kept to himself and paid cash. That was all. The first evening I noticed him, the sun was dropping behind the trees. I was unloading my car when I saw a shape at the edge of the woods across the road. A man stood half hidden by brush. He did not wave. He did not move. He watched the road as if waiting for something to pass. He wore dark clothes and a hat pulled low. His face stayed in shadow. When a truck came by, he stepped back into the trees and vanished. I told myself it meant nothing. Rural places had people who lived differently. I was new. I had no context. Over the next weeks, I learned his pattern. I never saw him during the day. Not once. At dusk he appeared. Always at the same spot where the trees thinned. Always standing still. Sometimes he stayed 5 minutes. Sometimes an hour. He never crossed the road. He never stepped closer to my house. He watched the pavement as light faded and insects started to hum. When full dark arrived, he was gone. The animals were next. A neighbor down the road posted about a missing dog. Then another mentioned a goat. People blamed coyotes. It made sense. The woods were thick, but the usual signs were missing. No tracks. No scattered remains. No noise at night. Just absence. A smell began drifting into my yard after sunset. It came low and slow, riding the humid air. Wet fur mixed with iron. It stuck to the back of my throat. I checked under the house. I checked the trash. I walked the fence line. I found nothing. The smell arrived after dark and left before morning. I started sleeping poorly. I worked with the windows shut. Fans moved stale air. At dusk I watched from the porch. The man appeared as always. Still, watching the road. I noticed then that he never looked at my house. Not once. His focus stayed on the road, as if that was the only thing that mattered. The woods across the road felt closer at night. The trees leaned inward. Sounds carried wrong. I heard movement after midnight. Not heavy. Careful. Something moving with purpose. The smell grew stronger on those nights. I stopped using the porch after dark. One evening the noise changed. It came from the woods behind my house, not across the road. Leaves shifted. Branches scraped bark. The sound moved in a straight line, not wandering. It passed behind the house and faded toward the trailer. That was when I realized the trailer was not as far back as I thought. The woods hid distance. The next morning I found blood on the edge of my yard. It soaked into the dirt in a dark patch. No tracks led away. No fur. No body. Just the smell and the stain. I called animal control. They took notes. They shrugged. Predators did strange things. They told me to keep lights on. The man did not appear that dusk. The woods stayed empty. The road stayed quiet. The smell came early and thick. I made a choice that night that I still regret. I took a flashlight and crossed the road. The ditch was shallow but slick. The woods swallowed sound fast. My light cut a narrow path through brush. The smell guided me more than sight. It grew stronger with every step. The trailer sat in a small clearing. It leaned to one side. The windows were black. No light. No generator hum. The door hung open. I stood there a long time listening. Insects buzzed. Something moved deeper in the woods. The trailer itself made no sound. Inside, the air was heavy and warm. The smell was overwhelming. Wet fur. Iron. Old rot. My light swept the floor. There was no furniture. No bed. No table. No signs of living. The walls were scarred. Long gouges cut into the paneling. Not shallow scratches. Deep marks that tore through wood. They ran in clusters as if made over time. The ceiling stopped me cold. Photographs covered it. Hundreds of them. Faces stared down. Men. Women. Children. All ages. All taken close. Some showed fear. Some showed confusion. Some looked unaware. The photos were taped in rows, overlapping, curling at the edges from heat. I backed out of the trailer and vomited in the dirt. My hands shook. My light fell and rolled, casting wild shadows. When I picked it up, I saw something else near the back wall. A trap. Heavy. Homemade. Blood stained the metal. Fur clung to the jaws. I left then. I did not run. I walked fast and steady. The woods felt alive around me. Every sound felt aimed. The next morning I packed my car. I called the sheriff. They came slow. They searched the trailer. They found bones buried behind it. Animal bones. Many of them. They took the photos. They took the trap. They found a path worn deep into the woods, leading away from the clearing. They told me the man had lived feral for years. He trapped animals and skinned them. He slept in the woods. The trailer was a shrine, not a home. The photos were stolen from houses and cars over decades. Faces collected, not people. He watched the road to choose moments to move unseen. They found him 2 days later miles away, thin and injured from a trap gone wrong. He did not resist. He did not speak. I left the town that week. The house stayed empty. The woods stayed quiet. The road carried traffic again. The smell never came back. I still think about the way he stood at dusk. Not watching me. Watching the road. Waiting for a gap. Waiting to move. I stayed at a friend's family cabin for a weekend in late fall, the kind of time when the trees are bare and the woods feel wider than they should. There were 4 of us total. I knew the friend well enough to trust him. The others were familiar faces from work and school. None of us had been to the cabin before except him. He described it as simple and quiet. That was the point. No cell service. No neighbors close enough to matter. He mentioned one man who lived about half a mile down the dirt road. Strange but harmless. That was how his parents always described him. The tone made it sound like a warning that had been repeated so often it lost weight. The drive-in took longer than expected. The road narrowed into packed dirt with deep ruts from old rain. The trees pressed close. The cabin appeared suddenly through the brush, a low shape with a metal roof and a porch that sagged a little in the middle. It smelled like dust and old wood inside. The air was cold even with the heat on. We unpacked, split firewood, and settled into the routine of being away from everything. Night came early. The woods went black in a way the city never does. The first night passed without much happening. Wind moved through the trees. Branches scraped the roof. The usual sounds you expect and then forget about. The second night felt different from the start. The air was still. The woods were quiet in a way that felt deliberate. We were inside after dark, lights on, cards spread across the table. I remember noticing how the windows reflected the room instead of the outside. Just darkness beyond the glass. The knocking came later, slow and spaced out. Not loud. Not aggressive. 3 solid taps against the front door. We froze before any of us moved. The sound was too clear to be a branch. It was too controlled. We waited a moment, then opened the door together. The porch was empty. The dirt in front of the steps was smooth and undisturbed. No footprints. No movement. When I looked down the road, I could see a porch light in the distance, blinking on and off in a steady rhythm. It was far enough away that the house itself was only a dark shape behind it. The light blinked at the same pace for several minutes. On, off, on, off. It did not flicker. It was being switched. We closed the door and locked it. No one said much. The idea of walking down that road in the dark felt wrong. The light kept blinking until it stopped all at once. The woods swallowed it. Later that night, I woke up to a sound that did not belong. It was above me, slow and heavy. Not scratching, not scurrying, something shifting its weight. The sound moved in a circle, stopping near the chimney, then continuing. The roof creaked under the pressure. I lay still and listened. My heart was loud enough that I worried it could be heard. Someone else stirred. A light came on. A flashlight beam cut across the ceiling and then angled up through the window toward the roof line. Nothing reflected back. No eyes. No movement. The sound continued for another minute, then stopped as suddenly as it began. Sleep did not come easily after that. Morning light felt like relief. When we stepped outside, the cold hit hard. The roof sloped low enough near the edge that we could see the shingles clearly. There were marks pressed into them. Handprints. Not smeared. Pressed down with force. The fingers were long and spread wide. Wider than my hand. Wider than any of ours. The impressions followed a rough circle around the chimney. The shingles were old and soft. They had taken the shape cleanly. We did not touch them. We stood there longer than we should have, staring up. The dirt around the cabin still showed no tracks. The road was empty. The woods were quiet again, as if nothing had happened. We left early. None of us argued. On the drive out, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up county records later that week. The neighbor property showed as vacant. The house had burned down years earlier. Electrical fire. Total loss. No rebuilding permit ever filed. No utilities connected since. That porch light should not have existed. I kept digging. Old news articles mentioned a man who lived alone there. Reclusive. Known to wander at night. The fire started while he was away. No suspects. No injuries. After that, reports of trespassing along the road increased. Tools went missing from nearby properties. Motion lights triggered without anyone seen. The man was questioned once and released. He had been living out of a trailer hidden back in the woods on his land. Off-grid. No power. No official address. The explanation settled into place slowly. The blinking light was not a house light. It was a battery lamp hung on a post. Switched by hand. A signal meant to draw attention or test reactions. The knocking was deliberate, measured to see if anyone would open the door alone. The movement on the roof was a man moving carefully, spreading his weight to avoid noise, misjudging the age of the shingles. The handprints were large because his hands were large. Long fingers from years of manual work. Strong enough to press down without slipping. He never broke in. He never needed to. He learned what he wanted from the response. We were together. Alert. Locked in. Not worth pushing further. The cabin was isolated. The road was his. He knew the land better than anyone. The burned house kept people away. The story did the rest. I still think about how close he was to us in the dark. How practiced the movements sounded. How patient the knocking was. It was not rage or madness. It was familiarity. The kind that comes from watching the same place for years, waiting for patterns, choosing moments. The county record closed the file years ago. Vacant land. No issues. The cabin is still rented out. The warning about the neighbor is still passed along in the same words. Strange but harmless. I do not believe that anymore. Harmless implies lack of intent. What I felt that night was intent held in check, not absence of it. I moved into the duplex because it was cheap and close to work. The town was small and tired, the kind of place where nothing new opened and nothing fully closed either. The landlord lived out of state. The ad mentioned a quiet neighbor. That mattered to me. The building had 2 units with a shared wall. Mine was on the left. The other belonged to a man named Ron, according to the mailbox. I did not meet him when I moved in. I did not see him at all during the day. His car sat behind the building near the fence, an old gray sedan that never changed position. Dust gathered on it. Leaves collected under the tires. At night I heard movement through the wall. Not footsteps. Slow sliding sounds. Soft impacts spaced far apart, as if something heavy was being shifted carefully. During the day there was nothing. No television. No radio. No voices. The other unit felt empty until after midnight. A light came on each night in a narrow side window next door. Yellow and weak, like a single lamp. No shadows ever crossed it. It stayed on for hours and shut off before dawn. I ignored it at first. A week later my trash went missing. I put my bin out behind the duplex when it was half full. When I came home from work the next day, it was empty. The lid was closed. Trash pickup was not scheduled. I assumed a mistake. It happened again the following week. My bin was emptied. His was untouched. After that I kept my trash inside until pickup day. Not long after, a smell started drifting through my kitchen at night. It was faint at first, damp and sour. Over time it grew sharper, metallic under the rot. It came through the wall and the vents. I cleaned my place and checked under sinks and behind appliances. Nothing on my side explained it. I started opening windows at night, even when it was cold. Between our units was a narrow strip of yard. One morning I noticed the weeds near the fence were pressed flat in a long line, as if someone had been pacing there over and over. The path led to the gate between our yards. It was unlocked. I locked it. 2 days later the lock was gone. The screws had been removed cleanly. I bought another lock and used longer screws. It lasted a week. One night I woke to the sound of my back door handle turning slowly. Not shaking. Testing. I stayed still until the sound stopped. When I checked in the morning, the door was still locked. No marks. I installed a small camera facing the back door and yard. The first night it recorded Ron stepping into my yard at 2:17 a.m. He wore dark clothes and gloves. He moved close to the fence, careful and quiet. He stood near my back door for several minutes, leaning slightly forward as if listening. Then he went to my trash bin, opened it, removed a bag, and carried it back through the gate. He never looked toward the camera. I stopped putting anything outside. I shredded mail. I sealed food waste and kept it inside. Ron kept coming anyway. The footage showed him standing near my door longer each time. One night, he crouched near the threshold and touched the frame lightly. Another night, he brought a small tape box and placed it beneath my kitchen window. I took the box to the police the next morning and showed them the footage. They told me the box contained preserved animal remains. They said Ron claimed he collected roadkill for study. They warned him to stay off my property. I stayed with a coworker for 2 nights. When I returned, the gate lock was gone again. Inside my unit, nothing was missing, but things were moved. A chair angled differently. A cabinet left open. Someone had been inside. That night the indoor camera recorded Ron in my kitchen at 3:08 a.m. He moved slowly, opening cabinets, touching counters. He stood at the foot of my bed for a long time. I was not home. I sent the footage to the police immediately. They searched his unit the next morning. Inside they found plastic bins stacked neatly, each labeled with dates. Not just animals, personal items, hair, teeth, notes tracking routines and movements. He had been documenting people in the area for years, choosing those who lived alone and kept predictable schedules. Ron was arrested that afternoon. I moved out under police supervision. The landlord let me break the lease without question. Later an officer told me Ron used trash to learn habits and entered homes to map layouts. He waited until the timing was right. He had not decided when to act on me yet. I live somewhere else now, in a building where I hear people through the walls at all hours. It helps me sleep. What stays with me is not fear in the moment. It is the quiet planning, the patience, the fact that for weeks someone was learning me piece by piece while I lived my life unaware, assuming silence meant safety. I moved into the house because it was new and clean and predictable. That mattered to me then. My wife liked that every yard had gravel instead of grass, and that nothing looked old enough to hide problems. Our daughter was 3. We wanted somewhere quiet where nothing unexpected happened. The development sat on the edge of the desert outside Phoenix. It had one road in and one road out. Every house looked the same from the street. Beige stucco, red tile roofs, 2-car garages. No trees tall enough to block the sun. No fences yet. The builder had not finished all the phases. Past the last row of homes, there was open land full of rock and scrub and dry wind. The man across the street stood out only because he lived alone. Everyone else had families. He was in his 40s maybe. Thin, Clean. He waved when we moved in but never crossed the street. He never spoke. He just raised one hand and went back inside. I worked from home. My office was the front bedroom. I faced the street. Most days were quiet. Delivery trucks. Contractors finishing nearby houses. Kids on bikes after school. After the first week, I noticed the man across the street standing in his driveway. He did not pace or stretch or check his phone. He stood still with his arms at his sides. He faced our house. At first I assumed he was looking at something else. Maybe the roof. Maybe the clouds. But after a few days I understood he was looking at our front door. Always the door. Not the window. Not me when I stood up. Not my car when I left. Only the door. He did this at different times. Sometimes mid-morning. Sometimes late afternoon. Once close to dusk when the light was flat and orange and the street felt empty. He stayed for long stretches. 10 minutes. 20. Once I timed it at almost 40 minutes. He never came closer. He never moved. I told myself it was nothing. New places make people watch each other. He might have been zoning out. He might have been dealing with something personal. I did not mention it to my wife because it sounded petty and I did not want to make her uneasy. Inside the house, everything felt normal. The walls were thin, but that was expected in new construction. I heard neighbors on both sides sometimes. The house on our left had a couple with a dog. The house on our right was empty. It backed up to the desert. The builder had poured the slab, but not started the next phase yet. Our side wall faced that open land. No one lived there. There was nothing there but dirt and wind. One afternoon my daughter was playing with blocks in the hallway. I was folding laundry. She stopped and pointed at the wall that separated our house from the empty lot. She asked who the man in the hallway was. She was not scared. Her voice was calm, curious. She pointed at the blank wall near the linen closet. I looked at the wall. There was nothing. No sound. No shadow. I asked what man she meant, and she pointed again. Same spot. I felt a chill, but I told myself kids say strange things. She was at an age where imagination bloomed. She watched cartoons. She mixed things up. I redirected her to her toys. She forgot about it quickly. I tried to forget it too. That night I woke up after midnight. The house was dark. The air conditioner hummed. I heard footsteps. They were inside the walls. Not above. Not outside. Inside. They were heavy. Measured. Too slow to be pipes knocking. Too rhythmic to be water. They moved back and forth along the wall that faced the desert. They stopped. Then started again. The sound traveled like someone pacing a narrow space. I lay still and listened. I could hear my wife breathing. My daughter did not stir. The steps continued for several minutes. Then they stopped. Silence returned. I did not sleep much after that. In the morning I walked the perimeter of the house. I checked the side yard. Nothing disturbed. The dirt was smooth. No footprints. No tools. I checked the attic access in the garage. It was closed. I climbed up anyway. The attic was clean. Insulation even. No signs of anyone crawling through. No dropped trash. No crushed paths. Across the street the man was gone. His driveway was empty. His garage door was shut. No car on the street. That alone meant little. People leave for work. People travel. But by noon there was still no sign of him. By evening nothing changed. The next day I noticed there was no for sale sign. No rental notice. No lockbox. The house looked untouched. Blinds closed. No lights at night. I asked the Homeowners Association for a list of emergency contacts for nearby houses under the excuse of a delivery issue. The address across the street was listed as vacant. The move-in date field was blank. I pulled the county records. The house had been sold to the developer again 2 months before we moved in. No record of a private owner since. No utilities registered in a personal name. That unsettled me more than anything else. I reviewed my memory carefully. I knew I had seen him. I had watched him for weeks. My wife confirmed she had waved back to him once. She remembered him standing there. Neither of us remembered him speaking. I contacted the builder. They said that house had been used by a contractor temporarily during construction. Someone who oversaw night security. He left before the final phase ended. They said sometimes those arrangements did not make it into public records. That explanation helped a little, but not enough. The footsteps returned the following night. Same wall. Same pacing. I stayed awake this time. I pressed my ear to the drywall. The sound felt closer, like weight shifting through studs. I felt vibration under my palm. I called the non-emergency line and reported a possible intruder in the structure. An officer arrived and searched the exterior. He found nothing. He explained that new houses settle and that animals sometimes get into unfinished crawl spaces. He suggested pest control. The next day I hired an inspector. He cut a small access panel in the wall near where my daughter had pointed. Behind the drywall, there was a narrow, unfinished service corridor. It ran between our house and the next foundation line. It was meant to be sealed later when the development expanded. For now it was hidden behind temporary walls. Inside that space were footprints, dust disturbed, a sleeping bag, empty water bottles, food wrappers, a folding chair. The space connected to the unfinished house across the street through utility access that ran under the road. It was meant for wiring and pipes. The man had been living there. He stood in his driveway because he was watching when we left and returned. He stared at the door because he was tracking patterns. He paced inside the wall because that was the only place he could move freely without being seen. My daughter saw him through a gap in the drywall near the baseboard where the panel was loose. She did not imagine anything. She saw a real person moving in a hidden space. The builder admitted that several temporary workers had access to the corridors during early construction. One had refused to leave when his contract ended. He had been removed quietly once before from another phase. No charges were filed. They assumed he moved on. He did not move on. He moved closer. Security sealed the corridor the same day. Cameras were installed. The unfinished lots were fenced. We stayed with family for a week. I never saw the man again. No one did. What stays with me is not fear of something unknown. It is the knowledge that someone can be close for a long time without crossing a line. Watching, learning, waiting. The house still looks clean and predictable from the street. I no longer trust that. I lock doors in daylight. I listen to walls at night. I know now that empty space is never truly empty. I grew up in a house that my parents had bought with the kind of optimism that comes with believing you can fix anything. The neighborhood was the kind that people avoided if they could, a stretch of cracked sidewalks and faded paint, where the streetlights flickered and the lawns were unkempt, but my parents saw potential. The house itself was rough. The siding peeled in strips, the roof sagged slightly at the corners, and the porch railings were brittle enough to snap if you leaned on them the wrong way. It smelled faintly of damp wood and old paint, and the floors creaked underfoot in a way that made you pause if you weren't expecting it. It was the kind of place you moved into knowing you would spend years repairing every inch, but to us it felt alive. Next door, the house was different. It was empty, or at least that's what everyone assumed. Windows were boarded over haphazardly. The lawn had grown wild with weeds and scrub brush, and the mailbox was crooked, leaning like it had given up on standing upright. Some neighbors said the house had been abandoned for years, and at first, we took their word for it. The first few weeks, the silence was complete. No sound came from behind those boards. No lights, no movement. Just the occasional wind rustling through the dead branches of the overgrown shrubs. At night, it felt like a wall separating us from nothing, a blank space beside us that should have been meaningless. But then the sound started. It was subtle at first, a faint murmur that I thought came from our own house. Sometimes it sounded like a television, sometimes like a radio, but always distant, muffled, impossible to place. I remember lying in my bed, trying to focus on the ticking of the clock, trying to convince myself that it was just the creaks of our old house settling, or some stray broadcast carried through the thin walls. Then it became impossible to ignore. You could hear the voices, clear enough to pick out the rhythm of speech, though the words themselves were a blur. Talk shows, debates, voices arguing, or maybe discussing news. Always on, always at night, but never long enough to settle on a single station. The quality was wrong, static underneath the words, a crackle that made it feel like it was happening inside your own head rather than across the fence. We checked the house. My father and I went one morning after the sun had just risen. We pushed on the boards with crowbars, expecting to see a hollow shell, maybe some rats, maybe the remnants of someone's life left behind. The interior was empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, not even dust in the shape of where something had once been. The walls were stripped, the wiring ripped out or cut, nothing connected to power. The floors were bare, just wood and plaster, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and decay, like a place that had been shut and forgotten for years. It made no sense. The sounds at night were impossible. There was no electricity, no wiring, no batteries, nothing that could transmit a signal. We tried to ignore it. We told ourselves it was the imagination, the stress of the move, the strange acoustics of old houses amplifying the hum of distant traffic or local stations. But the sounds didn't stop. They became more pronounced, more structured. It was impossible to mistake them for anything ordinary. You could hear pauses in speech, laughter, sighs, intonations that sounded human, like someone was speaking right there in the room. And then he appeared. It was a man at first, just a shadow at the edge of the yard. I noticed him the night my father was mowing the lawn. He was standing just beyond the fence, looking at us, the posture familiar and deliberate, like he knew where to be to catch our attention without stepping into our property. He wore ordinary clothes, faded and dirty, nothing remarkable, but it was the way he moved that unsettled me. Slow, careful, measured, as though he had memorized every step we might take. Over the next few weeks, he returned almost every night. Sometimes he stayed in the edge of the shadows and watched. Sometimes he crossed into the yard when we were outside, asking to use the phone. He knew our names. He knew when we left for work or errands. He knew what days we would be gone the longest. There was no introduction, no explanation, just an acknowledgement that he belonged there, somewhere in the margins of our lives. The police were called. The first time we told them about the noises, the empty house, the man in the yard. They came, took notes, promised patrols, promised checks, but nothing changed. The man never fled when they arrived. He never spoke or resisted. He simply disappeared into the shadows, as if he had melted into the night. It didn't feel like trespassing. It felt like surveillance, deliberate, patient, and calculated. I began sleeping with a baseball bat under my bed, my door locked, windows latched and covered with blankets. Every creak, every shuffle in the dark made me tense. Every time I opened the blinds, I half expected to see him standing in the yard, staring. He tried the back door one night. I remember it clearly. The snow had fallen thick, covering the yard in a muffled silence. I had been reading in the living room, the warm glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. Then the door handle rattled. Slow, deliberate, testing the lock. My stomach dropped. I stayed still, listening to the faintest scrape as he tried again, his hands moving with precision, as though he had studied the lock for weeks. I reached for the phone, but my hands were shaking. Then a step back. A pause. Another tug. I could see his silhouette through the frosted glass, a dark figure framed by snow, cold light reflecting off his coat. The figure never spoke. He never moved from the threshold for long, only long enough to remind me he was there. Then he disappeared down the alley, melting into the snow. The police came quickly after that. We gave descriptions, photographs, timestamps, every detail we could recall. They searched the area extensively. Houses, alleys, abandoned lots, empty streets. They came back saying no one matching his description lived anywhere near us. Not within 50 miles. Not anywhere in the county. We were left with the certainty that this man existed, knew us intimately, and yet could not be traced. The thought settled heavily, a weight pressing in the chest, a kind of disbelief that took root and grew into a constant unease. Over time we adjusted. We installed security cameras, reinforced locks, kept lights on at all hours. I began recording the sounds at night, trying to capture the radio voices, but every recording came back blank. There was nothing, silence on the tape, as though the sound only existed for us in that place, in that house, in those nights. The snow continued to hide his footsteps, the grass continued to flatten under no discernible pattern, and every time we left the house, I could swear I felt him there, waiting, patient. The empty house next door remained the same, boarded, abandoned, stripped to its skeleton, yet somehow still a source of intrusion. Every now and then, we would see movement behind the boards, shadows shifting at angles that made no sense. Once, my father shone a flashlight through a crack and saw a figure move from one corner of a window to another, slow, deliberate, almost choreographed. He swore he was seeing things. We didn't speak of it after. Eventually, my parents sold the house. We moved to a different part of town, to a newer neighborhood where everything felt alive and predictable. The empty house stayed behind, fenced and vacant, yet I know it wasn't truly empty. The thought of him, of someone watching and knowing everything about us without existing on any map or record, stayed with me. I drive past that street sometimes, years later, and the house stands the same, silent and decrepit, yet somehow breathing with the same patience. The radio voices never left my mind, the way he knew exactly when to appear, exactly where to be, exactly what to do. I have never known who he was, or how he managed to exist in that liminal space between our world and nothing. I have never known if he was alone or if he had accomplices hidden behind walls, beneath floorboards, or in the streets we never walked. All I know is the certainty that some people can watch you, know you, and remain entirely untouchable. That understanding has stayed with me longer than the fear, longer than the nights spent listening to muffled voices through the walls, longer than the snow-covered footsteps in our backyard. The house was abandoned, the neighborhood was dying, yet he was there, patient, deliberate, and entirely beyond our reach. The ending is simple, yet unsatisfying in its own way. We left. He stayed. And the house, the street, the empty lot next door, remains a monument to someone who existed outside the normal rules, watching, waiting, and knowing everything about us while we could only imagine his presence. No confrontation, no capture, no resolution beyond leaving, beyond walking away, carrying the unease with us like a permanent scar. Some things, I've learned, cannot be explained, only endured.